I'll break it down. Self-esteem, oftentimes when you hear people say self-worth, self-esteem, they often get conflated. And I have a different definition. I might have a different definition for these things than others. But here's the way I understand self-esteem and self-worth and the difference between the two. Self-esteem is basically just your confidence. It's how confident you are in yourself. And you can build confidence in so many different ways. You could go to join a boxing class or a wrestling, ballet, gymnastics. It doesn't have to be those things. It could be crafts. It could be learning a skill. Just anything that you're progressing at and having a pretty good success rate at, that'll build your confidence and that will raise your self-esteem. But that won't necessarily raise your self-worth. It can raise your self-worth, and it inadvertently will raise your self-worth. But how is self-worth different than self-esteem? Self-worth is actually self-respect. Self-respect. So what's the difference? Your sense of guilt can affect your sense of self-worth, but it won't affect your self-esteem necessarily. So let me give you the example. Let's say you have a drinking problem or a drug problem, and while you're under the influence, you end up doing a bunch of amoral things or things that you know are unethical. You might steal from people or even sell your body or just something that violates your own morals. I'm not even saying that prostitution is wrong or anything like that, because it is the world's oldest profession, and we're all human beings together. So we can't judge people all the time for their choices and what they want to do. Like, sex is a normal biological need that we all got. And so, but in that underworld, obviously there's a lot of loose moral, like there's people, it attracts a lot of people who might have different ethics and morals than what's within the Overton window. The Overton window is what is acceptable or what is socially, for the most part, acceptable. So gangsters, pimps, strippers, prostitutes, like these are all people that exist on the outskirts of the Overton window, but they are human beings as well. But I'm using them as an example of self-worth because this is a common occurrence that happens within this realm of society. So let's say you have a drinking or drug problem and you go around committing amoral acts that violate your own ethical code. This is going to lower your self-worth. So you're not going to feel worthy of respect. So this is kind of why people end up on Skid Row. So here's an interesting concept. Not all of them, but a lot of people, when they end up on Skid Row, have a reaction of peace or of relief. Like they're actually relieved to get there. And it actually feels like they're welcoming it, like it's home. Why do they feel that way? Because it's a self-worth thing. So you guys may know of the shadow, because I've talked about the shadow a lot. The shadow is just the toilet of your mind, where you flush all your negative feelings and thoughts that you don't want to deal with. You flush them all down this toilet, which then in the future, all that stuff you flushed bubbles up in the form of a life event or circumstances. And now the deception that you've been living the whole time to keep that stuff repressed, keep that stuff flushed down the toilet, because that's also what happens. The way you repress unwanted emotions and feelings is you have to build a house of cards, and you have to build a persona that will hide that stuff from the public. So as you are creating this deception, this persona to use to interact with the world with, everything that you're repressing, and let's say it's a low self-worth, like let's say you have some shady past or something and you have a low self-worth because of it, eventually you can keep up the game for as long as possible until you can't, until you have a life slip up where let's say you lose control. So you lose control, and now you cannot maintain this house of cards any longer. And then fissures start happening, and then the floor between that separates the conscious and unconscious breaks, and the shadow realm comes to the surface, and it goes through your entire life, destroying and deconstructing all the lies until you're left with who you really are, which sucks, but it's not necessarily who you fundamentally are, but it's who you've been running from the whole time, which is a low self-worth, a low respect for yourself, because you don't think you're deserving of it or something. And it could happen in other ways besides violating your own morals. It could happen because you grew up in an abusive family environment where they wanted you to have a low worth, so then you have a low worth, self-worth. But it doesn't have to end up like all the way on Skid Row. Like a lot of people with low self-worths, you don't have to end up on Skid Row. You could just also end up in that income bracket. So like it's not just income, it's wealth altogether. Because if you define wealth, what is wealth? Wealth is your health, and it's enough money to be happy and you to be happy. That's what wealth is. Or it's like you have an abundance of energy and of love, and that's what wealth is. So if you have a low self-worth, deep down you might not feel worthy of love, of all these things. And so you might even have low standards. If you have a low self-worth, it's going to lower your standards too. Like you're going to settle for things. Even though you could have something much better. If you have a low self-worth, you're going to actually feel at home settling for less. So self-worth is something that is unconscious. It's something that you're unconsciously holding. It's a belief. It's an unconscious belief that you're holding about yourself. So although it's good to raise your confidence with all these things, you also got to raise your self-worth, or at least ask yourself like what your self-worth is. You don't have to have a megalomaniacal self-worth that's so inflated, like I need to rule the world and I need to take over and I need to be a billionaire, I need to be a great genius. Like it doesn't have to be that serious. It just needs to be where you would like it. So if you're not where you are in life, it's a place to look to see like what is your self-worth. Because like here's the other thing. The more respect you have for yourself, your standards will just be there. Like, I'm not saying all grimy people have a low self-worth, but this is just an example, like self-care. If you look at someone who doesn't take care of themselves, automatically you kind of assume they have a low self-worth. They have a low self-respect for themselves, because how could they possibly let themselves go like that? Like, and not notice, and just allow themselves to fall apart. Unless they're doing it for like philosophical reasons. Like some people are just nihilistic, or they don't care about their health or certain things. But it's just in general, the more respect you have for yourself, your whole environment is going to be a certain way. Like if you have a high respect for yourself, you're not going to go without dental maintenance and diet maintenance and all these things for too long without noticing. So this is why self-worth is important. So like Skid Row, a lot of people end up there because they have a low self-worth, and then the drugs and the addictions and all that stuff, that's actually the catalyst. That's actually a lot of times is the catalyst. But the person who is out of control like that, who is susceptible, addiction is also a disease, and I do believe that too, but there's a lot of different cases. So for some of these cases, and actually quite a few of them, a lot of times people start out with a low self-worth internally. It's like a little seed of evil that contains the roots of its own destruction within it. and it becomes a locus in your mind, like an invisible virus. And I'm also, this is from actually meeting people on Skid Row in recovery telling me these stories. So yeah, that's why I thought it was so interesting that as they're approaching arrival on Skid Row, that they had that reaction of like, wow, like this actually feels like home. It does not feel like hell. Because in a way, they don't have to maintain a lie anymore. Like the truth is revealed, and they could just be and not have to keep maintaining this lie anymore. They could finally be free and liberated. It may look nuts, like they're living on the streets homeless, but existentially it's freeing to a lot of them. And that's how they get stuck on Skid Row. So that brings us to this next question right now, is what is happening with the homeless issues in cities going across America, how they're building these skyscrapers to put them in. Because a lot of people, like I said, of course, I'm not trying to say that homeless people, like there's legit homeless people. But homelessness is it's also, like I said, it can be a self-worth thing, where even if you take these people off the streets and give them housing and hook them up with like a job at just Salvation Army or whatever you do, they end up back there because that's what I'm saying. People will say, they write it out, mental illness, but it's like this low self-worth thing a lot of times, where they feel at peace. That's where they feel like that's where they belong. And but yeah, of course they're all legit. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that we're all human beings. I don't look at them like, oh, you can't get your shit together and you're mentally ill. But this is just unfortunate for people that spiral down into the bottom of society. So that's like the collective shadow right there. And yeah, so it's a really interesting phenomenon, though, what's happening right now with these homeless and lifestyles that are happening. But it's also the perfect temperature too. That's the other thing. Right now is the perfect temperature to breed this insanity, this hell on earth, which is like places like Skid Row and just like all this tent cities popping up around. This is the perfect. So because you have so many different drugs that are so easy to get, and you have the pandemic, the COVID, and the shifting of the economy to the digitized economy, and the shifting of life also to a digitized lifestyle. So all of these rapid changes, this is not a gradual change that happens over time. This is an overnight 100, it's a civilization 180. And it is just the perfect time for all this to happen. So that's why there's a difference between, let's say, if you believe in God. Let's say, and I'm not judging or nothing like that. Let's just say you believe in God. So ask yourself, is it better to follow a person that has been chosen as the representative of God, or is it better to follow a sage or a person who was just a man but became a sage by demonstrating wisdom? Anyway, so think about your self-worth, and if you want to stay out of a downward spiral in life, then it's imperative to raise your self-worth to a sufficient setting that suits you and your highest purpose or your highest place